The Battle of Threshold Reach lasted 11 hours. By the end of it, the Terran Compact's colonial defense fleet was a debris field. 40 ships, reduced to scrap and vapor, scattered across a border system most of the galaxy had never heard of. The Skarn Hierarchy called it a formality. A border skirmish ended the way all their border skirmishes ended. Hierarchy doctrine measured victory in tonnage destroyed and territory claimed, and by that measure, Threshold Reach was as clean a win as any in the Marshal's long career. Aboard the colonial cruiser Meridian's Watch, in the final hour of the engagement, a young tactical officer named Priya Ansel strapped into an escape pod alongside 11 other crew members, watching through a narrow viewport as her ship, evacuated of all but a skeleton bridge crew 20 minutes earlier, took the hit that would end it. "That's the Watch gone," the pod's pilot said quietly, watching the debris scatter on a secondary display. "She did her job," Ansel said. "So did we." None of the 12 people in that pod had been told the full scope of what they were part of. They had been told, in careful, compartmentalized briefings, that their evacuation was mission critical, that the appearance of total defeat mattered more than any single ship, and that questioning the order too closely would only put the mission at risk. Most of them assumed it was simple battlefield pragmatism. None of them yet understood they were watching the opening move of a war that would not be won, with a single weapon fired. High Marshal Voss stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Judgment Spire, and watched the last human vessel go dark on the tactical display. He had fought this war for 3 years, annexing colony after colony along the Compact's outer rim. Threshold Reach was, by his own estimate, the 40th system to fall. "Human survivors requesting communication," his aide reported. "Colonial Defense Commander. Designation, Commodore Elias Novak." "Patch him through," Voss said. "Let's hear him beg." The channel opened. Novak's face appeared on the display, streaked with soot, his bridge visibly burning behind him. He did not look like a man about to beg. "High Marshal Voss," Novak said, "the colonial defense fleet at Threshold Reach is destroyed. I am authorized to request terms of surrender on behalf of the Terran Compact." Voss allowed himself a slow, satisfied breath. "Terms will be dictated," Voss said. "Not requested. Your compact will accept whatever terms the hierarchy proposes, or this war continues until there is no compact left to negotiate with." "Understood," Novak said. "We accept in principle. Formal negotiations at your convenience, Marshal." Voss studied the human's face a moment longer. There was something in the man's expression that did not match the words "not fear," "not defeat," something closer to patience, but Voss dismissed it as a trick of the transmission static. He had seen 100 defeated commanders wear 100 different masks. This was simply one more. "Convenient," Voss said, "would be tomorrow. My flagship's legal division does not enjoy waiting." The channel closed. Voss turned to his aide, a narrow, ambitious officer named Corin Dahl. 40 systems, Voss said. "The Compact's outer rim has fallen faster than any campaign in hierarchy history. Draft the surrender terms tonight. I want their remaining colonies stripped of anything resembling a fleet before the ink dries." "Yes, Marshal," Dahl said. "Should we expect resistance during negotiation?" Voss looked at the wreckage still drifting on his tactical display. 40 ships reduced to scrap in 11 hours. "They just lost their entire border fleet," Voss said. "They have nothing left to resist with." He did not know, standing on the bridge of a ship he believed had just won a war, that the destruction of the colonial defense fleet at Threshold Reach had cost the Terran Compact exactly as much as it had been designed to cost, and not one ship more. Phase 1 complete. The negotiations took place aboard a neutral station in the Threshold system, in a chamber built for exactly this purpose: humiliation, formalized into legal language. Ambassador Naomi Reyes represented the Terran Compact. She was not a soldier. She wore no uniform, carried no visible rank, and arrived alone except for a single aide carrying a data case. Marshal Voss had expected a broken military officer. He got a woman who looked, by his own private assessment, entirely too calm for someone signing away her species' future. The hierarchy's terms are as follows, Voss said, sliding a data slate across the table. Full reparations, paid in raw materials and refined alloys for a period of 20 years. Permanent hierarchy garrisons stationed on the 6 largest compact colonies for security purposes. Full inspection rights over all compact shipyards and research facilities to prevent rearmament, and extraction rights over the threshold asteroid belt, effective immediately. Reyes reviewed the slate without visible reaction. "The compact accepts," she said. Voss blinked. In 3 years of war, he had never once heard an enemy accept terms this severe without a single counterdemand. "You understand what you are agreeing to," Voss said. "Hierarchy garrisons on your soil, our inspectors in your facilities, your colonies supplying our war machine for 2 decades. "We understand," Reyes said. "We have one addition, not a counter-demand, a clarification for the sake of a clean treaty." "Go on." "Garrison logistics," Reyes said. "Fuel, food, water, spare parts, anything your station forces require to remain operational on compact worlds, will be supplied directly by the compact, under the reparations framework, rather than shipped independently from hierarchy space. It reduces your logistical burden. It also lets us track exactly what we owe you to the unit, so there is never a dispute over the reparations ledger." Voss considered this. It sounded on its surface like a courtesy, a defeated species smoothing the transition for its conqueror, eager to avoid further conflict. "Agreed," Voss said. "Draft it into the accord." "There is one more clause," Reyes said. "Reciprocal inspection rights. If hierarchy inspectors are permitted into compact shipyards to verify disarmament, compact liaison officers should be permitted equal access to hierarchy maintenance facilities stationed on our worlds, to verify the garrisons themselves remain within treaty-authorized limits. A formality. It protects both sides from accusations of bad faith." Voss almost laughed. A defeated species, asking for the right to watch its conqueror's own soldiers maintain their own ships, dressed up as a courtesy to protect the conqueror from accusations. "Granted," Voss said, already thinking of it as a meaningless concession. "Anything else?" "No, Marshal," Reyes said. "The compact is ready to sign." She signed the Kestrel Accords 20 minutes later, in front of a hierarchy legal delegation that would later describe the entire session, in their own internal reports, as the fastest and most complete surrender in hierarchy military history. Voss returned to his flagship that night in the closest thing to celebration his rigid temperament allowed. 40 systems annexed, he told Dahl, pouring 2 glasses of the hierarchy's ceremonial spirit. A war won in 3 years, a peace signed in 20 minutes. The humans understood in the end exactly how weak their position was. "A toast then, Marshal," Dahl said, raising his glass, though something in his expression did not fully match the gesture. "You hesitate," Voss said, noticing. "It is nothing, Marshal, only an observation." "Speak it." "In 3 years of this war," Dahl said carefully, "I have never once seen an enemy commander sign terms this severe without at least attempting to negotiate a single clause downward. Ambassador Reyes did not argue reparations. She did not argue garrison placement. She added clauses of her own, and every one of them sounded like a courtesy." "You think a defeated species capable of resistance," Voss said, "would have offered us easier terms and asked for more in return." "I think," Dahl said, "that a species clever enough to survive as long as this one has, against enemies stronger than itself, does not become suddenly foolish the moment it loses a single battle." Voss considered that for a moment, then set his glass down unfinished. "You worry too much, Dahl," he said. though his voice carried less certainty than it had an hour earlier. They have no fleet left, no industry capable of rebuilding one within the reparations window. Whatever cleverness this species possesses, it cannot manufacture ships it does not have the resources to build. No, Marshal Dahl said, perhaps not. He raised his glass again, and this time Voss matched the gesture, and the moment of doubt passed, unspoken and unresolved, the way most doubts do in the hours after a victory feels complete. To the Kestrel Accords, Voss said, the cleanest victory of my career. Neither of them noticed, in that private moment of satisfaction, that every clause Ambassador Reyes had requested, the garrison logistics, the reciprocal inspections, even the extraction rights over an asteroid belt the hierarchy had assumed, was simply worthless rock, had been drafted, word for word, by a Terran Compact planning division that had spent 25 years preparing for exactly this treaty, long before the hierarchy had ever fired its first shot. Phase 2 complete. The first sign of trouble came 6 weeks after the Accords were signed, in the Threshold asteroid belt. A hierarchy mining consortium, exercising its newly granted extraction rights, sent a survey team of 12 vessels into the belt to catalog resource deposits. The belt had shown nothing but standard mineral readings during the war, unremarkable rock, exa. CTLY, as the pre-war compact survey data had described it. The survey team's lead engineer, a methodical officer named Tessa Corvin, no relation to the hierarchy, simply a compact liaison assigned to observe extraction operations under the treaty's monitoring clause, watched the hierarchy vessels move deeper into the belt from a safe distance. They're approaching Sector 11, Corvin reported, back to a compact relay station disguised as a routine communications outpost. Standard mining formation, no unusual activity. Copy, the relay operator replied. Sector 11 is inside the marked zone. Confirm your own vessel has cleared to minimum safe distance. Confirmed, Corvin said, clear and holding. What happened next was never fully explained to the hierarchy's own investigators, not because the truth was hidden particularly well, but because no one on the hierarchy side thought to ask the right questions. Sector 11 of the Threshold Belt had been seeded, 30 years earlier, with a defense grid so old and so quiet that it did not register on any active scan performed during the war. It had been built to do exactly one thing: distinguish between a compact vessel and anything else, and respond accordingly to anything else. The 12 hierarchy survey ships lost power simultaneously. Not destroyed, disabled. Engines and weapons alike going dark within the same 4-second window, drifting helpless among the rock they had come to catalog. Report, Voss said, when the news reached the Judgment Spire an hour later. What happened to the survey team? Unknown, Marshal Dahl said. All 12 vessels report total power failure. No weapons fire detected. No enemy contacts logged. An accident, Voss said. A drive malfunction, replicated across 12 separate ships simultaneously. That seems statistically unlikely, Marshal. Then investigate it, Voss said. Quietly. I do not want a diplomatic incident over an asteroid field 6 weeks after we won this war. 2 weeks later, before the asteroid belt investigation had produced a single useful conclusion, a second incident occurred at Garrison 3, stationed on the compact colony world of Aldrin Hollow. A reparation shipment of refined fuel arrived exactly on schedule, escorted by a compact logistics vessel that departed the moment its cargo was verified and offloaded. Garrison engineers ran the standard purity scan required under the treaty's inspection clause. The fuel passed every test. 3 days later, the Garrison's secondary reactor bank failed without warning during a routine power cycle, cascading through 2 adjacent systems before engineers could isolate the fault. No fire, no explosion, simply a slow, methodical collapse of power across an entire wing of the Garrison's support infrastructure, timed in a way that damaged nothing critical enough to trigger an emergency alert until the damage was already extensive. Garrison Prefect Yurkesin filed a formal report to Hierarchy Command that night, flagging the failure as unusual but not yet alarming. Fuel purity confirmed twice, Kessin's report read. Failure signature does not match any known contamination profile in Hierarchy engineering records. Recommend further analysis before drawing conclusions. Voss read Kessin's report the same week the asteroid belt investigation finally reached his desk, and for the first time since signing the Kestrel Accords, allowed himself to consider that the two incidents might not be separate at all. The investigation, delayed by the same bureaucratic caution that had made the Hierarchy's victory feel so complete, took 3 more months to conclude. By the time it did, 2 more incidents had occurred. A garrison shipment of reparations fuel, delivered under the treaty's logistics clause, that registered as pure and verified on every scan, yet caused a cascading power failure in the garrison's secondary reactor bank. And a routine reciprocal inspection, conducted by a compact liaison officer inside a Hierarchy maintenance yard, that resulted in a full diagnostic map of every Hierarchy vessel stationed on compact soil being quietly, legally, and entirely within treaty rights, recorded and transmitted home. Voss reviewed all 3 incidents in a single briefing, seated at the head of a table that had, 6 months earlier, felt like the site of his greatest triumph. 3 unrelated incidents, Dahl said, presenting the findings. Statistically, Marshal, that is a difficult coincidence to accept. They are not unrelated, Voss said slowly, the first real doubt of his career settling into his voice. Show me the original Accord language again, every clause from the beginning. Dahl pulled the treaty onto the display. Voss read it in full for the first time since signing it, no longer as a victor reviewing the terms of his conquest, but as a commander searching for the shape of a trap he had walked into without noticing the walls. Phase 3 complete. 25 years before the Battle of Threshold Reach, the Terran Compact had fought a much smaller war against a much smaller enemy and lost it badly. The enemy was a minor raiding faction, long since absorbed into Hierarchy space, remembered by almost no one outside a handful of compact military archives. Their name, recorded in those archives, was the Voss Reavers, a coincidence of naming that later analysts would note without ever finding any actual connection to the Hierarchy Marshal, who would, decades later, sign the very treaty their doctrine helped defeat. The Reavers had struck a single outlying compact mining colony, overwhelming its meager defense force in less than a day, and dictated a peace so punishing that the colony's economy did not recover for a generation. A young analyst named Naomi Reyes, 23 years old and 3 months into her first ministry posting, had watched the negotiation recordings dozens of times afterward, transcribing every clause the Reavers had demanded, searching for a pattern she could not yet name. They took everything they could carry and dictated terms for everything they couldn't, she told her supervisor, presenting an early draft of what would eventually become her founding report. And we let them, because we had already lost the battle and believed the negotiation was simply where we counted our losses. That's what a negotiation is, Reyes, her supervisor said. You lost, you pay. Then why, Reyes asked, does every losing side in every war I've studied pay a price shaped entirely by what the winner thought to ask for? No one ever seems to ask what the loser could have offered instead, on terms that cost the winner more than they realized they were accepting. Her supervisor did not have an answer. Neither, for a long time, did she. It took her another 2 years of independent study, conducted largely on her own time, before the shape of an answer finally began to take hold, that the terms of a surrender were negotiable in ways almost no defeated power had ever tried to exploit, because almost no defeated power had ever approached a peace table with anything other than despair. The Compact's response to that early defeat became the foundation of everything that followed. A young strategist named Naomi Reyes, then a junior analyst attached to the Compact's Colonial Defense Ministry, wrote a report that senior officials nearly buried for being too strange to act on. "We keep losing wars we should win," Reyes wrote in the report's opening line, "and we keep winning peace negotiations we should lose. No one has ever asked why." Her answer, laid out across 200 pages, became the founding document of a program that would come to be called the Ledger Protocol. Its premise was simple, and almost no one who first read it believed it could work. Wars were won on the battlefield. Peace was won at the negotiating table. A species clever enough to lose the right battle, at the right moment, in the right way, could dictate a peace that cost its enemy more than total military victory ever could. "You cannot bluff a treaty," Reyes told the Ministry Review Board, defending her proposal for the first time. "But you can architect one. Every clause a conqueror demands is an opportunity if you understand what that clause actually requires them to do. Reparations require shipments. Shipments require logistics. Logistics require access. Access, properly structured, becomes leverage." A senior minister on the review board, a cautious administrator named Havard Chen, pressed her further. "You are describing a plan that requires losing a war we have not yet been asked to fight, against an enemy we have not yet identified. How does this ministry approve funding for a war that does not exist?" "We do not need to know the enemy," Reyes said. "We need to know the shape of every enemy who has ever conquered someone weaker than themselves. That shape does not change much, minister, regardless of what species wears it. They demand reparations. They demand inspection rights. They demand garrisons." Every empire that has ever dictated peace terms to a defeated people has reached for the same handful of tools, because those tools work, and because victors rarely question a strategy that has always worked before. "And if this hypothetical enemy demands something outside that pattern, then we adapt," Reyes said. "But minister, in 40 years of studying conquest across a dozen documented interstellar conflicts, I have never once found an empire that dictated terms it did not, on some level, already believe it deserved. Arrogance is not a variable in this plan. It is the constant we are building around." The board approved a small pilot budget, mostly to avoid the embarrassment of rejecting a proposal none of them fully understood. 25 years later, that small pilot budget had become one of the most closely guarded programs in Compact history, second only to its mill. Itery counterpart and inseparable from it. The Ledger Protocol did not build ships. It built treaties before the wars that would require them. Legal strategists spent decades drafting clause language for 100 different surrender scenarios, refining logistics dependency structures, reciprocal inspection frameworks, and reparations mechanisms so thoroughly ordinary that no conquering power would think twice before signing them. When Compact intelligence first detected the Skarn Hierarchy's border incursions, 3 years before threshold reach, Reyes, by then the protocol's director, did not recommend reinforcing the border fleet. She recommended studying the hierarchy's own legal doctrine, its treaty history, its cultural instinct to dictate rather than negotiate terms. For 18 months before the war's first shot, Reyes ran a small team out of an unremarkable office building in the Compact's administrative capital, a location so deliberately ordinary that most of her own staff believed they worked for a trade compliance division. Analysts cross-referenced centuries of hierarchy annexation records, building a model of exactly which clauses a hierarchy negotiator would reach for, in exactly what order, under exactly what conditions of apparent victory. "They favor garrisons over direct occupation," one analyst reported, presenting findings to Reyes late one evening, long after the rest of the building had emptied for the day. "It lets them claim territory without committing to full civil administration. It is efficient. It is also, structurally, almost identical to the access model we have been drafting language for since the protocol's second decade. Then we already have the clause written, Reyes said. We simply need them to ask for it. The team's final report, delivered to the Compact War Council 18 months before threshold reach, did not recommend avoiding war. It recommended losing one, carefully, at a location and moment of the Compact's own choosing, before the hierarchy's full invasion force ever reached a system that actually mattered. They will demand total surrender, Reyes told the Compact's War Council, 18 months before the first shot of the war was fired. They will not accept a negotiated peace between equals. That instinct is their greatest weakness. A species that only knows how to write the terms of someone else's defeat will not read those terms carefully. They will simply enjoy writing them. You are proposing we lose the war on purpose, a council member said. I am proposing we choose which war we lose, Reyes said, so that we can choose which peace we win. Commodore Elias Novak, then a rising colonial defense officer, was one of only 4 people briefed on the full scope of the plan before threshold reach. His fleet was never meant to win that battle. It was meant to lose it convincingly enough that the hierarchy would believe total victory was within reach, and dictate exactly the kind of arrogant, sweeping terms the Ledger Protocol had spent 2 decades preparing for. 40 ships, Novak had said, reviewing the mission briefing months before the battle, his voice carrying the weight of what he was being asked to do. 40 ships and every crew member aboard them, sacrificed to sell a defeat. Every ship in that fleet is crewed by volunteers who understand the mission, Reyes told him. Full evacuation protocols are built into the engagement plan. We are staging a defeat, Commodore. We are not staging a massacre. And if the hierarchy fleet moves faster than our evacuation window allows, if a single miscalculation turns a staged loss into an actual one, then people I have known for 20 years will die for a plan I wrote, Reyes said, without flinching from the question. I am not asking you to accept a risk I have not already accepted myself, Commodore. I have run this scenario 1,100 times in simulation. I have adjusted the evacuation window 9 separate times based on those results. I am as certain as 25 years of preparation can make anyone. Novak studied her for a long moment before answering. My father served in the war that started this program, he said finally. He used to say the Compact never truly loses a fight. It just sometimes takes longer than anyone watching expects to see who actually won. Then you understand exactly what I'm asking of you, Reyes said. I do, Novak said. I'll fly the mission. The Battle of Threshold Reach unfolded exactly as planned. 40 ships, evacuated of all but skeleton crews in the battle's final hour, destroyed in a defeat convincing enough that High Marshal Voss never once questioned why a defeated enemy negotiated its own destruction with such calm, practiced efficiency. Every clause of the Kestrel Accords, the garrison logistics, the reciprocal inspections, the asteroid belt extraction rights, had been sitting in a Ledger Protocol archive for over a decade, waiting for an enemy arrogant enough to sign them without reading past the first page. Admiral Okafor, commanding the Compact's true fleet from a position the hierarchy had never detected, received the activation order the same night Marshal Voss finally reread the treaty in full. 25 years, Okafor said, standing in a command center built inside a moon the hierarchy's own survey ships had once dismissed as geologically unremarkable. 25 years of paperwork, finally becoming a war. Not a war, Reyes said, her voice carried into the same room through a secure relay. A collection notice. They signed a debt, Admiral. It's time we collected it. Phase 4 complete. The collection began on a single coordinated night, timed to a garrison shift rotation. The reciprocal inspection clause had let Compact liaison officers quietly document for months. At each of the 6 hierarchy garrisons stationed on Compact worlds, the reparations fuel shipments, verified pure, verified within treaty specifications, delivered exactly as the Kestrel Accords required, simultaneously triggered dormant cascade failures seeded years earlier into the refining process itself. A vulnerability the Ledger Protocol had built into compact fuel, exports the moment the treaty's logistics clause was first drafted. Garrison Prefect Yurkesin, commanding the largest of the 6 garrisons, watched half his fleet lose power within the same 90-second window, and understood, with a speed his superiors would later envy, exactly what was happening. "This is not a malfunction," Kessin said, already moving toward the garrison's command deck. "Signal the judgment spire. Tell Marshal Voss the humans have moved." His transmission never reached the judgment spire intact. The relay station carrying it, built under the treaty's own communications-sharing clause, had been quietly compromised for over a year by compact technicians granted routine maintenance access under yet another ordinary-sounding provision of the Accords. Kessin tried a second channel, then a third, watching each attempt dissolve into static that no longer felt accidental. Around him, his command deck crew worked through checklists built for engagement against an enemy fleet, not for a silence that had no visible source and no clear point of origin. "Prefect," his communications officer said, "local systems are responding normally. The fault appears to be isolated entirely to off-garrison relays." "Then get a courier ship moving," Kessin said. "Physical transit if the signal will not carry. I want Marshal Voss to know what is happening here before this becomes something we cannot walk back from." The courier launched 9 minutes later, carrying a report that would not reach Hierarchy Command until long after the night's outcome had already been decided. Across the 6 garrisons, the same story repeated with only minor variation. Ships that had spent months undergoing joint maintenance inspections, a courtesy extended, at Hierarchy insistence, to demonstrate treaty compliance, failed in precisely the systems those inspections had most recently serviced. Fuel reserves, delivered on schedule and verified pure, became inert the moment their onboard systems queried a status code the Ledger Protocol had embedded into the reparations shipping manifest years before a single barrel was ever produced. Admiral Okafor's fleet did not need to fire a single shot to disable 4 of the 6 garrisons. The remaining 2, still combat-capable, found themselves facing a compact strike force that had spent 3 years training in secret for exactly this engagement, using tactics the Hierarchy's own inspectors had unknowingly helped refine by documenting, in exhaustive treaty-mandated detail, every weakness in Hierarchy ship design. "Garrison 7 reports engagement," Okafor's tactical officer said, watching the battle unfold on the display. "Their shields are holding against our first wave." "Then hit their reactor coupling," Okafor said. "The reciprocal inspection reports from 8 months ago flagged a thermal tolerance issue in that exact system. They filed the maintenance request themselves. We just never told them we read it." The first strike group closed on Garrison 7's remaining cruisers in tight, coordinated formation, targeting the precise coupling weakness the treaty's own paperwork had unknowingly revealed. Shields that had held against the opening volley buckled within the second pass, unable to compensate for a strike pattern built specifically around a flaw their own engineers had documented and requested repair funding for 6 months earlier, through channels that had gone, at the time, entirely unremarked. "Their lead cruiser is losing power," the tactical officer reported. "Second cruiser attempting to break formation and retreat toward open space." "Let it go," Okafor said. "One ship reporting home tells the Hierarchy less than a full garrison going dark all at once with no explanation at all. Let them wonder for now exactly how much we know." The engagement lasted 40 minutes. Garrison 7's remaining ships, already weakened by cascading fuel failures across their support vessels, could not sustain a defense built around the assumption that their opponent did not already know every structural weakness in their fleet. Garrison 4 told a quieter story. Its commander, a cautious officer named Prefect Sorn Halbeck, had grown suspicious of the reciprocal inspection program months earlier, after noticing that Compact liaison officers seemed to take an unusual interest in maintenance logs rather than the weapons systems his own superiors had assumed would draw the most scrutiny. Halbeck had quietly restricted access to his garrison's most sensitive systems, in violation of the treaty's letter, but within what he privately considered its reasonable spirit. That caution bought Garrison 4 nothing on the night of the collection. Its fuel reserves failed on schedule, alongside every other garrison's, because the vulnerability had never lived in the systems Halbeck restricted access to. It had lived in the fuel itself, refined and shipped from Compact worlds months before any inspector ever set foot inside his garrison's walls. "I limited their access," Halbeck said afterward, in a report he filed from a garrison that could no longer defend itself, watching Compact vessels move to secure the system without resistance. "I assumed the danger was in what we let them see. I never considered the danger was in what we agreed to burn." Halbeck's garrison surrendered without further loss of life on either side, the only one of the 6 to do so. A small Mercy Okafor's fleet extended without being asked, because a defeated garrison offered no further strategic value beyond the message its capture already sent. Marshal Voss, aboard the Judgment Spire, received the first coherent report of the night 3 hours after it began, delayed by a communications network he no longer trusted. "All 6 garrisons," Dahl reported, his voice hollow. 4 disabled without a shot fired, 2 engaged and destroyed. "Marshal, this did not happen in a single night. This happened because of decisions we made willingly over the last 6 months." Voss stared at the tactical display, at 6 garrisons, the physical proof of what he had believed was total victory, reduced, in a single coordinated action, to wreckage and silence. "Recall every hierarchy vessel still in Compact space," Voss said. "Full withdrawal. I want to know exactly how deep this goes before we lose anything else." The order came too late to matter. By the time the recall reached what remained of the hierarchy's presence in Compact territory, Admiral Okafor's fleet had already moved to secure the threshold asteroid belt in full, activating a defense grid. The hierarchy had spent 6 weeks assuming was an accident of geology rather than a deliberate 30-year-old trap. Phase 5 complete. News of the Battle of Threshold Reach reached Compact civilian networks the same week it happened, framed by public affairs officers as a tragic but necessary sacrifice, the loss of 40 ships in defense of the border. Most citizens of the Compact never learned otherwise. They mourned the crews of the Meridian's Watch and its sister vessels as casualties of a war their species had lost, and quietly, grimly, made peace with the 6 years of hardship the reparations terms would impose on Compact industry. A journalist named Farah Delgado, covering the signing of the Kestrel Accords for a Compact news network, filed a report at the time that captured the public mood with more accuracy than she knew. "The Compact did not win this war," Delgado's broadcast said, "but it survived it, and today it signed a peace that will define a generation. Whatever comes next, it will be built on the terms we accepted today, not the terms we would have chosen." Delgado did not learn the truth about Threshold Reach until the night of the Garrison collection, when Compact military spokespeople finally released a carefully worded statement describing coordinated enforcement actions against hierarchy forces occupying Compact territory. She spent the following weeks piecing together, from public records and cautious off-the-record conversations, a story her editors initially refused to believe. "You're telling me the surrender was the plan," Delgado said, sitting across from a retired Compact defense analyst who had agreed to speak only after confirming twice that his name would not appear in the story. I'm telling you the surrender was the opening move, the analyst said. Everyone who lived through Threshold Reach lost something real. That part was never a lie. What was a lie, if you want to call it that, was letting the galaxy believe we lost the only way that mattered. Delgado's story ran 3 weeks later, under a headline that would eventually become the closest thing the war add to a lasting epitaph in compact popular memory. They thought the war ended in their favor. The hierarchy's ruling council convened within days, in a chamber far less ceremonial than the negotiating table where the Kestrel Accords had been signed. Marshal Voss stood before it, no longer the architect of the cleanest victory of his career, but the officer who would have to explain how that victory had unraveled in a single night. Casualty and material report, the presiding counselor said, a stern administrator named Ilsa Drav, who had approved the original war with barely a formality vote 3 years earlier. 6 garrisons, Voss said. Approximately 11,000 personnel killed, captured, or missing. 62 vessels destroyed or disabled. Complete loss of the threshold extraction operation. Complete loss of hierarchy presence in compact territory. In a single night, Drav said, we lost more than in the final year of the war itself. Yes, counselor. A second counselor, an older, decorated war veteran named Torv Bellic, leaned forward. I approve the original war authorization, Marshal. I sat in this chamber 3 years ago and voted to annex the Compact's border systems because our military assessment rated their defense capability as negligible. I would like to understand how negligible became this. Their defense capability was accurately assessed, Counselor, Voss said. Their fleet was negligible. What we failed to assess was their patience, and their willingness to lose that fleet on purpose in exchange for something we would never think to defend. Explain how a defeated species accomplished this. Voss activated the display, laying out the Kestrel Accords clause by clause, the same document he had once described to Dahl as the cleanest victory of his career. Every clause we demanded became a mechanism, Voss said. The reparations logistics gave them scheduled access to our garrisons. The reciprocal inspections gave them documented knowledge of our ships' every weakness. The extraction rights sent our own people directly into a defense grid they had built decades before we ever arrived. We did not simply lose a battle, Counselor. We signed the instructions for our own defeat and called it a victory because we assumed a defeated species would never be clever enough to right them. They lost the war, Drav said, disbelief edging into her voice. 40 ships, an entire colonial defense fleet destroyed at Threshold Reach. That was not staged. I believe it was, Voss said quietly. I believe every part of it was staged, Counselor, going back further than either of us have security clearance to fully confirm. I do not believe we defeated the Terran Compact 3 years ago. I believe we walked, willingly and with great satisfaction, into a plan they had been writing for longer than most of us have served in this council. Bellic studied Voss for a long moment, the veteran officer's expression unreadable. You believe a single human strategist did this. One office, one plan, running longer than our own careers. I believe it does not matter whether it was one strategist or 100, Voss said. I believe what matters is that we never once considered the possibility, because we have never lost badly enough in 3 centuries to need to consider it. This species has apparently been losing on purpose since long before we ever found them, Counselor. That is not a weakness. I no longer know what to call it, but it is not a weakness. A junior counselor, seated near the chamber's edge, spoke for the first time. If that is true, Marshal, then every treaty this hierarchy has ever dictated to a defeated enemy should be reviewed. If this species could plan a defeat convincing enough to fool your entire fleet, we cannot assume any surrender we have ever accepted was genuine. Drav did not answer immediately. The question hung in the chamber, unanswered, because no one present had any framework for calculating an answer. 3 centuries of hierarchy conquest had been built on a single, unquestioned assumption, that the terms of surrender belonged to the victor, and that a defeated species accepted whatever terms it was given because it had no other choice. No one in that chamber had ever considered that a defeated species might choose its own defeat, in order to choose the peace that followed it. "Draft a formal request," Drav said finally, "to the Terran Compact. I want to speak with whoever actually wrote this treaty." Phase 6 complete. Ambassador Naomi Reyes arrived at the same neutral station where the Kestrel Accords had been signed, 6 months earlier, under circumstances that could not have been more different. Marshal Voss stood waiting for her this time, without doll, without a legal delegation, without any of the ceremony that had marked their first meeting. "Counselor Drav sends her regards," Voss said, and her question, "Was threshold reach a genuine defeat, Ambassador? Or was it always this?" Reyes considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Does it matter, Marshal?" she said. "The treaty is signed. The terms were yours to write. We simply read them more carefully than you did." "It matters to me," Voss said. "I gave the order that killed 40 of your ships. I would like to know whether that order accomplished anything at all." Reyes studied him a moment longer, and for the first time since their negotiations began, something in her expression softened, not into sympathy, but into something closer to honesty. "Every crew member aboard those 40 ships was evacuated before the final engagement," she said. "The battle was real, Marshal. The ships were real. The loss was real. What was not real was the certainty you walked away from it with. We did not need you to lose cheaply. We needed you to believe completely that you had won." Voss absorbed that in silence. "You won the war," Reyes said. "That was never in question. We wrote the peace. That was the only part that was ever actually ours to decide." "And if I had read the treaty more carefully," Voss said, "if I had questioned a single clause before signing it." "Then we would have offered you a different clause," Reyes said, "and another after that until you signed something. A species that only knows how to dictate terms will always sign something, Marshal. We simply made certain that whatever you signed worked for us instead of against us." "How many versions of that treaty exist?" Voss asked. "Sitting in whatever office wrote the one I signed." "More than I am authorized to tell you," Reyes said. "Enough that it would not have mattered which one you chose." Voss absorbed that for a long moment, something in his rigid posture finally giving way to plain exhaustion. "Commodore Novak," he said, "the man who negotiated the surrender with me at Threshold Reach, was he part of this from the beginning?" "He commanded the fleet that lost the battle you believed you won," Reyes said. "He requested to be present for the negotiation himself, against my advice. I believe he wanted to look you in the eye while doing it." "Why?" "You would have to ask him," Reyes said. "I suspect it mattered to him that the humiliation was earned honestly, even if the outcome was not." Voss looked out at the stars beyond the chamber's viewport, at a border he had once believed marked the edge of a completed conquest. "What happens now?" he said. "Now the hierarchy withdraws from every system it annexed during this war," Reyes said, "under terms we will be presenting to your council within the week. I would recommend reading this one more carefully." She turned to leave, then paused at the chamber's edge. "One more thing, Marshal," she said. "You asked your council to review every treaty the hierarchy has ever dictated to a defeated enemy. I would encourage that review. I suspect you will not enjoy what you find in most of them, but I would also encourage you to consider something else while you conduct it." "What is that?" "You are not the only power in this galaxy who has learned that lesson the hard way," Reyes said. "You are simply the first one we chose to teach it to." She left the chamber without waiting for a response. Phase 7 complete. Commodore Elias Novak received the news of the hierarchy's withdrawal aboard a repair yard, orbiting a compact world he had not seen since before the war began. He read the report twice, standing alone on an observation deck, overlooking the slow, patient work of rebuilding a fleet that had, for 3 years, existed mostly as a plan on paper. A young officer approached him with a data slate, one of the newer recruits assigned to the yard, too junior to have been briefed on anything beyond the official history of the war's end. "Sir," the officer said, "they're saying the peace terms did more damage than the whole war combined. Is that true?" Novak considered the question for a long moment, thinking of 40 ships and the crews who had trusted an order they were never allowed to fully understand. "The war cost us people," Novak said. "Real ones. I'd be careful about calling anything that followed a clean victory, son. Nothing about this was clean. It was just in the end ours." The officer did not fully understand the answer, and Novak did not explain further. Some debts, he had learned, were better carried quietly than displayed. 3 weeks after the hierarchy's formal withdrawal began, a single unregistered vessel entered the outer edge of the threshold system, moving with the same deliberate caution a predator uses when approaching prey it has just watched defeat something larger than itself. It held position at the edge of sensor range for 11 hours, gathering data, before retreating quietly back into the dark it had come from. Admiral Okafor's tracking station logged the contact, flagged it as unidentified, and forwarded the report directly to Naomi Reyes' office within the H. Hour. "Not hierarchy configuration," the report read. "Not any registered compact catalog design. Departed without attempting contact." Reyes read the report twice, then set it down on her desk, beside a copy of the Kestrel Accords that would soon be filed away as a closed chapter of compact history. She called Okafor directly rather than waiting for a scheduled briefing. "Admiral," she said, "I want a full analysis of that contact's flight profile before it leaves our sensor network entirely. Drive signature, hull dimensions, anything at all we can reconstruct." "You think it's connected to the hierarchy," Okafor said. "I think it isn't," Reyes said. "The hierarchy has never shown restraint like that in 3 years of war. Whoever sent that ship has been watching long enough to know exactly how much distance to keep. That is not curiosity, Admiral. That is caution. And caution, in my experience, usually means someone out there already understands more about us than we understand about them." "The Ledger Protocol has a plan for every enemy we've studied," Okafor said. "Does it have one for an enemy we haven't found yet?" "It has a framework," Reyes said. "Frameworks are not the same as plans. We will need to build the rest as we learn who we're building it for." 25 years had built one treaty. She was already certain, reading the unidentified contact's flight profile a third time, that it would not be the last one the Ledger Protocol would need to write. Somewhere out past the edge of the dark, something had been watching the hierarchy's defeat with far more attention than a simple border skirmish should have earned. The Terran Compact had learned, at great cost and greater patience, that the terms of a war were never truly decided on the battlefield. The rest of the galaxy was only beginning to learn the same lesson. A war was fought, a peace was signed, the battlefield decided nothing, the paperwork decided everything. Apex Chronicle will return.